Welcome to a special episode of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean text, and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you too find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at Epicureanfriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we're very pleased to bring you an interview with a special guest, Dr. Emily Austin, Professor of Philosophy at Wake Forest University. Dr. Austin is author of the book Living for Pleasure, An Epicurean Guide to Life, which was published in November 2022 by the Oxford University Press as part of its Guides to the Good Life series. Dr. Austin graduated from Hendrix College in Arkansas, and she received her doctorate from Washington University in St. Louis in 2009. Since that time, she's been teaching philosophy at Wake Forest in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Dr. Austin's book has been getting great reviews, in large part due to her combination of philosophical detail with a friendly and engaging approach. We'll be calling her Emily during most of the podcast, but don't let that informality cause you to underestimate her work. Dr. Austin applies both her academic credentials and her teaching skills to the task of showing how Epicurean philosophy differs sharply from Stoicism, and how it stands for a truly positive approach to life that is not grounded in asceticism, but in the central and uncompromising appreciation of pleasure in the pursuit of happiness. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Austin, and tell us about yourself.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks, Cassius. I've been looking forward to this for a while. So, like you said, I grew up in Arkansas, in Little Rock, and I majored in philosophy in college, went to graduate school. Actually, I hated graduate school, and I quit for a year. And then I went back and completely changed my interest in philosophy. So I went to graduate school to study 20th century analytic philosophy, and somehow ended up studying ancient Greek philosophy. And like you said, I now live in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and I've lived here for quite a long time. I have recently spent my summer in Wyoming, and I'm hoping to spend summers there in the future, in part because I now have a job as campground host for the National Forest Service at a campground in Wyoming. So I like to say that I split my time between North Carolina and Wyoming.
Well, great. What we're going to be doing today is talking about both Epicurean philosophy in general and your book in particular. And so our format that we'll follow is I'll introduce a topic and Dr. Austin will respond, and then our panelists will make comments and ask follow-up questions. So Dr. Austin, what made you decide to get interested in Epicurean philosophy in the first place? And tell us about the writing of your book, which I see is published by Oxford University Press, part of a series, I understand. So tell us about the background of your book.
Right. So I'm actually, at least most of my research has been on Plato historically, and I didn't really know anything about Epicurus until I got to graduate school. The rise in Stoicism has sort of, and kind of the research interest in Hellenistic philosophy in general has made it more common for undergraduates to know some stuff about Stoicism and Epicureanism, but it's not part of the standard undergraduate education. So when I went to graduate school, I didn't know much of anything about Epicurus. And I zeroed in on a research project on Plato and the fear of death. And whenever I would tell people that I work on death in ancient Greek philosophy, they would say, oh, Epicurus. And I thought, no, Plato. But I realized that that was something I needed to know. And so I started working on Epicurus, and my advisor taught a graduate seminar on it. And I discovered that I really liked Epicurus, and I had an idea about Epicurus on the fear of death. So I started working on that and ended up publishing a paper on Epicurus and death. But then during my pre-tenure years, I wrote almost exclusively on Plato. But after tenure, I taught Hellenistic philosophy class, in part again because people are so interested in Stoicism these days. And so I got to have Epicurus come along for the ride. And there's nothing really quite like teaching something to make you get it. So by that point, I really liked Epicurus, but I didn't have any designs to write a book on him. And actually, I was at a conference with some friends And they were talking about this Guides to the Good Life series and how sort of novel it was and how they were interested in writing a book for it. And this one woman wanted to write the Skepticism volume, and this guy wanted to write the Plato volume. And then they just said, but who would possibly write the Epicurus volume? No one. And I thought, well, that doesn't, I'm a philosopher, so I needed to contest that. And I started giving this defense of why Epicureanism was really good philosophy for this series. And I found myself so passionate that I wondered whether I should be the one to write the book. And I went back and talked to my students, and I said, well, I'm not sure I should write a book that's too close to an advice book. And they asked why. And I said, because I'm not terribly good at living. It's not like I'm a life coach. But they convinced me to do it. And I approached the editors, and I had to convince them that Epicurus was a suitable philosophy for the volume. But eventually they came around too. And I wrote the book. And it was the most satisfying writing experience that I've had as a philosopher.
Emily, I want to pick up on something you said, which was that this was the book that you most enjoyed writing. I shouldn't say book, but the thing that you wrote that you most enjoyed writing. I think Cassius and Colosini and maybe Martin, we had a conversation with somebody the other day discussing various books pertaining to Epicurean philosophy. And the point that this person made was that he could tell reading your book that you really enjoyed writing it. So it's interesting to see how that comes through in the text. Sometimes you read books on philosophy and the person who's writing the book is bored. The person who's reading the book is bored. One thing I can say about your book, Living for Pleasure, is I don't think anybody's bored. And certainly I wasn't when I read it. It's been very interesting to read it. And, your book only came out in November. So it's interesting to see the way in which, in some ways, it has actually changed the conversation. So I'm happy you enjoyed writing it. I'm happy you wrote it because it's a very good book to read. And it's a book that I'm going to turn to again and again in our interest on this subject.
That's great to hear. It's mainly that, I guess it was two reasons. One is that I got to sort of unleash the parts of my prose style that are not welcome in formal writing. So you can't be terribly playful in a philosophy journal article. But also, I think, and this is something I say, I think at the end of the book, it actually helped me a lot to write it because there are a lot of things that I thought, well, that's not a healthy thing to care about in life. But I couldn't exactly explain why. And having to sit down and justify some of Epicurus's claims that I agreed with, but to actually give them, some sort of underlying justification, I found it difficult, but also clarifying for myself. So it wasn't just that it was fun prose-wise, but that it seems a little cliche to say I grew from the experience, but I think that's true.
I totally believe you on that point because my experience in doing this podcast has been I have learned so much more about this subject from having to come up here every week and defend it in front of an invisible audience like we're doing right now. So I totally understand that point. And like I said, I'm just happy you undertook the time and what it took to do it.
And now that we've heard her here and in some of the other interviews that she's done, I'm ready for the audiobook version now.
Oh, me too.
Yeah,
me too.
Somebody asked me about that, and I don't know how that works through Oxford, and I think a lot of people record their own work. And I had thought about that, but I'm still a little terrified of my voice being recorded. I'm getting past that enough that I might be willing to do it. But
yeah, that was me. That was the first question I asked you was, when's the audiobook coming out? Because it's such a great book, and the character of the person writing it really comes through. And so to have it read is a real experience that hopefully I can look forward to one day.
Well, here's one of the themes of what we're going to be discussing for the rest of the podcast today. Presumably, most of the people listening to our podcast are interested in how Epicurean philosophy differs from Stoicism. Dr. Austin's brought up already that there was certainly a lot of argument between the schools in the ancient world, and that argument continues on today. And while we don't want to make this podcast focused entirely on contrasting Stoicism and Epicurean philosophy, probably the most important thing for our listeners to hear would be what Dr. Austin thinks about the major aspects of Epicurean philosophy that distinguish it, and what are some of the most important principles to take away from the question of why someone should want to study Epicurean philosophy.
Yeah, so it's obviously a big question, so I'll just try to zero in on some stuff that I think does appeal to my students and myself. So one thing about Epicurus is that even more than the Stoics, I think, he thinks philosophy is in the service of living well. And by that, I mean that philosophy is almost useless unless it serves that purpose. So a lot of people think of philosophy as impractical, and Epicurus thinks that if it is impractical, then it's not worth doing. So people should naturally be drawn to taking Epicurus seriously as a contender simply because we all want to live a good life. And Epicurus is a hedonist, which makes him very distinctive in the ancient world because a lot of the arguments of his predecessors either just completely dismissed hedonism as, a life fit for beast, or when they did take hedonism seriously, they marshaled a series of arguments to the effect that, it couldn't be what we aimed at. It had to be either we had to stop thinking about pleasure, or it was always going to be downstream, not what we should focus on. So one thing is that taking Epicurus seriously as a hedonist makes him very distinctive. The later Epicureans chose a series of commitments of Epicureanism to distill into what's called the tetrapharmakos, which is the fourfold remedy. And while I think there's a lot of other stuff that happens in Epicureanism, and taking Epicureanism to just be the justification for these four principles, I think that's sort of a mistake, but they do draw out some big themes in Epicureanism. And so, as you all probably know, but maybe listeners don't, the tetrapharmakos has four components, which is that God presents no fears and death no evils. So those are the first two. And then the good is easy to get or can be gotten, if you focus on it. And then the bad can be endured. So the first two, I think, are actually, in some sense, the most interesting differences between Stoicism and Epicureanism. So when Epicurus says that God presents no fears, some people have mistaken Epicurus to be an atheist, but I think that much like other ancient Greek philosophers, he's just sort of a revisionist. So he thinks that most people have the wrong view of the gods. And so Epicurus has a very controversial view because he thinks that the gods don't play a role in creating the universe. So the universe was not designed by the gods, and the Stoics think it was. And then the gods don't intervene in life either to benefit or to harm or, as they might be interested capriciously. So they don't interact with us. And in fact, actually, Epicurus thinks they don't get invested in us. So they don't really care what we do. That would be beneath them. And so there's a sense in which Epicurus thinks that one of the great fears people have is that they'll suffer the wrath of God either in this life or the next life, perhaps for reasons they don't even understand. And Epicurus wants to get rid of that fear. And obviously, we can talk more about that if you're interested in it. So he has a God that doesn't create the universe, end the universe, or punish or reward people. And that, I think, is very controversial, but I find it pretty compelling because it solves a lot of problems, I think. And then the idea that we shouldn't fear death or death presents no evils, that's another thing that's very central to Epicureanism. And in part, that's from his hedonism. So he thinks that what hedonism says is that what we want and what we consider good or what is good for us is pleasure, and what is bad for us is pain. And so we have incentive to pursue pleasure, but also to avoid pain. And one of the sources of anxiety, again, is the idea that the gods could be angry at us. But another is that death is the end of our existence. And Epicurus offers a series of arguments to the effect that, that's not bad for us, that death ends our existence is not bad. And so he really, I think, has two main arguments. The first is that non-existence is not bad. And so because it's not bad, we shouldn't fear it. But the other is that it's actually bad for us to wish for an endless life, so that we make a mistake by thinking that our life needs to be very long. And he thinks that the reason is that we'll never be satisfied with what we have if we think we need more. And so if we need another day or another day after that, then this day will never be enough for us. And so I think part of his plan is not just to get rid of our fear of non-existence, but also to have us orient our lives towards satisfaction with what we have rather than that we need more and more of it. So those are the first two. God presents no fears and death no evils. And then the second two are more concerned with the practical philosophy. So the good is easy to get and the bad we can endure. And I think, when people say the good is easy to get, people think like, oh, right, yeah, tell that to the poor working mother. And I think that one thing to know is that for Epicurus, what counts as good, at least at root is what's necessary for a good life for creatures like us. And he thinks that if we organize our individual and to some extent our community priorities right, then we'll be able to get the necessities. And the necessities are not just food and water and shelter. It's also the sorts of things that give us a sense of security. So things like knowing that you have friends who will be there for you, knowing that you know how to navigate the world and understand it through science. So there's kind of a bigger group of things that are necessary than we think of as bare necessities like food and drink and water. But it's still, Epicurus thinks if we prioritize, we can get those things. And then there are other things Epicurus thinks are good. And they are, fancier versions of those things. They can include various kinds of extravagances. And he thinks those are actually often very available without struggle. They're not necessary, but they are, they really contribute goodness to our lives. But what distinguishes them is that they're not the sorts of things that give you anxiety. And so he thinks that if we prioritize the goods, we can get them. And then the bad is easy to endure. I mean, to some extent, he might be overselling his wares there because really bad things are not easy to endure. But he does think that he has a set of strategies to help people get through bad things. And so one thing that's distinctive about Epicureanism as opposed to Stoicism is that when somebody suffers a grave misfortune in Stoicism, the response is, well, this is part of a universal plan. God set in motion the origins of the universe and God made things good. And so everything that happens in the universe is good. So when your child dies, regardless of whether you understand why God did that, it was a good reason. And when you have a universe like Epicurus's that wasn't designed, it certainly wasn't designed for the good, then you don't find yourself saying, oh, well, these bad things are actually good in a way I don't understand. They're just bad. And so what Epicurus wants to do is to say, those don't get rid of your chances for living a good life. And there are ways that you can handle them. And here I think he has this, what I consider super distinctive view, which is that when we suffer a misfortune, we need friends because that's just something he thinks we need and they help get us through it. But also he thinks that if we live a really pleasant life filled with rich memories, we can sort of dip into that bank of memories to distract us and get through the difficult times. And so he doesn't think it's easy to endure in the sense that it's not bad. He thinks that there are tools that a person who has organized their life well will be able to draw on to get through adversity. And those include friends, but also memories and other kinds of pleasant distractions. So I'm not sure that there are lots of other parts of Epicureanism that are fascinating, like his views on justice and deep into the views on friendship. But I do think that fourfold remedy gives you a map of what makes Epicureanism distinctive. Just the revisionist theology, the conception of death, and the idea that if we prioritize things, we can get what we need and we can endure what's bad.
That is one of the best expositions of the Tetrapharmakos I think I've ever heard. So thank you very much for that. I do also appreciate the way you formulated the first and second lines of those, because I've often seen them given as almost commandments in some translations where it's like, don't fear God, don't worry about death. And to me, I've never seen that in the texts themselves. It's more, to me, observations of how things are as opposed to commandments. And I think that you've done a great job in paraphrasing those and translating those in a much more accurate and approachable way. So thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
Dr. Austin, as you started your answer there, one objection that many people make, they'll agree with almost every item that you've listed in practical terms as sounding like a good idea. But in the end, they just cannot live with the idea that pleasure can be an accurate or full description of what ought to be the goal of life. How would you deal with this question of ultimately, can pleasure really be the foundation of what life is all about?
I go back and forth about this. Part of me just thinks that for Epicurus, we are animals. And the way that we get to know the world is through our five senses, but also our feelings of pleasure and pain. And so in some sense, he would just think, well, that's where everything has to start. And so in some sense, we're just hedonists by nature. So we feel pleasure is good and pain is bad. And that's the way we navigate the world. And so insofar as we figure out what a good life for creatures like us would look like, we're still always going to be doing that through reflection on pleasure and pain. And that makes it sound like he could start from pleasure and pain and then just go way off into like duty and obligation, which I don't think he does. So I do think he thinks that what we fundamentally want is pleasure, and what we fundamentally don't want is pain. And the thing that he wants us to be able to do is to reason well about those things. And so, at least as far as if other people say, oh, well, pleasure just can't be all there is. And I think something like, well, describe to me your good life. And I don't think people can do it without thinking of all of those things as contributing to a rich human life. Now, some people will say, oh, but I just really love pain. And I find that super weird. And that comes out more when people say, Epicurus is opposed to ambition, or Epicurus is opposed to, I don't know, CrossFit or something. So I think that oddly, what people object to is not so much that pleasure is good. They just really think that a lot of the things that cause pain are good. And so they think, well, surely I can't, avoid these things like ambition. And so pain is part of the human existence. So sometimes I don't think they think it's about duty. They just think pain is good.
I think that you raise a good point there, because even in that, it seems to me, if people were going to make those kinds of arguments, that if they're saying, I love the pain of a hard 5K run or, marathon or whatever it is. But if you dig down, they're still, it seems to me at least, taking pleasure in the fact that they're completing the run, that they're doing something that they find challenging, and they're taking pleasure in that. So even at the root of that, it seems there's still a hint of pleasure in there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think Epicurus is a psychological hedonist, which just essentially means that when we pursue things, we are pursuing pleasure. So I don't think he thinks, if someone says, oh, no, I don't do a marathon for pleasure, I do it for a sense of obligation or something. I think Epicurus would say something like, well, that's what you think you're doing it for, but you're really doing it for pleasure. But I think even if it weren't the case that we just, all our actions are aimed at pleasure, whether we agree with that or not, I think that is a good example of where if you ask someone, why do you do it, it would eventually end in pleasure. So I think a lot of it is just, I don't know, sometimes I think it's just that the culture is so opposed to pleasure that you have to convince people that they themselves are not really, upon reflection, opposed to pleasure.
Oh, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Exactly. I think it's definitely a cultural thing. Thank you, Puritans, for establishing what we call American culture. But yeah, I think that's a lot of it. Yeah, definitely.
Those people were weird. I did a lot of study of the Puritans. And in fact, they were the people who got me interested in death, because I took a history of death in America course in college. And it was the most fascinating class I took in college. And so when I went to graduate school, I was already kind of primed to be thinking about death related things. But the Puritans had the weirdest views about death of anybody I've ever run into, which is a topic for another day. But yes, the fact that they launched our culture explains a lot of our dysfunction.
Agreed.
It's interesting that one of the early English translations of Lucretius comes from a very interesting Puritan woman named Lucy Hutchinson, a poem which she did not publish, would not allow to be published. But she sent it to the Earl of Anglesey with a note attached saying, if this was still in my hands, I would burn it. I disavow every tenet in this poem and regret my wanton dalliance with impious books, I think is how she puts it. So you're right. It is a very interesting movement. You mentioned something a bit ago about how Epicurus could have gone in the direction of obligation and duty, but he didn't. I think there's going to be people, particularly people reading Lucretius, who are going to actually take that as a point of criticism. I'm thinking particularly of this scene that Lucretius paints of himself standing on an eminence looking over the ocean and seeing a dire shipwreck or a battle at sea, and seeing all of these people struggling in horrifying pain, torment, people drowning, and thinking to himself, sure glad I'm not out there doing that right now. But you handled this, I think, rather well in your book. So I wanted to give you a chance to maybe go into it a little bit here and hopefully put a better light on it. We've talked about it on the podcast before, but you probably have some insights that we could benefit from.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful passage. And you can tell that Lucretius is really proud of his poetry there. But yeah, I've made my peace with it. But you're right that it sounds amazingly condescending, almost literally, because he's on a cliff looking down on them. But I'm not sure. There are parts of me sometimes that I just want to say something like, well, Lucretius is not always having his best day. Sometimes he's just smug. But I do think that he is criticizing the ways that some of our pernicious desires or counterproductive desires, in the book I call them corrosive desires, can lead us to do things that put us in peril. And so some of those things I think he's describing are things that, you wouldn't be in those situations if it weren't for bad desire. So I think even he thinks the people who are subject to shipwreck in that part, they are on a boat because they're traders. So they're off to get riches. So they sail the sea to get money. And that's a very risky venture. And so here they are about to be shipwrecked because of their greed. And I think he thinks the same thing explains war. And so the people who are in battle are there not necessarily because they themselves are greedy, perhaps they were conscripted or forced into the war, but because human beings are greedy for power or land. And so there is a sense in which I can see how he thinks like these are the things that result when people give rein to their corrosive desires. But I do think that there's a certain condescension in that because, I think that for me, the point of Epicureanism is not to become a sage or a saint. I don't think that's really possible. And so there's a sense in which I think that's not a good way to convert people to say, hey, you guys are all idiots and I'm kind of mocking you. I think there would be a gentler way to say wars start because of corrosive desires and shipwrecks are often the result of greed.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I think we could probably give Lucretius the benefit of the doubt here by saying he doesn't see himself as being in an ivory tower in this case. He wants everyone on that cliff. And he's trying to do that through his poem, but not everyone's going to get up there would be a way to put it.
Yeah, but, my father, whenever he would tell a joke that didn't land, something entirely corny, and no one would laugh, he would say they can't all be gems. And so I think that sometimes we just have to give people, maybe it was, he just really wanted to write that passage and maybe he shouldn't have, but that's not reason to give him up.
I've also seen those episodes in Lucretius as a way of making sure that you have gratitude for the situation that you find yourself in, so that you're not necessarily taking schadenfreude from the people that are in the shipwreck, but you are grateful for the situation that you find yourself. And so that's how I've sort of tried to spin it in my own head.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there are lots of ways to give a charitable read of Epicurus there. And I think there are good reasons to do that. But I do understand why some people read that passage and consider it cruel.
Oh, definitely agree.
Dr. Austin, you've mentioned death several times and the Puritans' view of death. It's always seemed to me that it's an important part of Epicurean philosophy that the reason that you're pursuing living well is that if you know that your life is short and you're not going to be living in heaven in the future, or if you only have one chance, you're going to take life very seriously and make sure you don't waste your time. And with your past study of death, I'm wondering if you see a connection between one's view of death and one's view of Epicurean philosophy.
Yeah, I do. One of the things that didn't occur to me, strangely, well, it did occur to me to some extent, but I didn't think when I started the book that I would write a chapter about the desire for sort of limitless life. If you reject immortality, but you just want to prolong your life as long as possible, I hadn't thought of that as a desire that Epicurus really wanted to get rid of. So I guess the main thing I hadn't realized is that prolonging your life is a corrosive desire for him, or a desire to have more and more. And so I do think that once you realize that the desire that a lot of these CEOs have to live immortally through technology, that Epicurus wouldn't approve of that, and then why he wouldn't, I do think that changes your attitude towards daily living. So although the phrase eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die is associated with Epicurus, he never wrote it as far as we know. But I do think that captures something about Epicureanism, not the idea that you spend your day at some drunken wine party every day, but that there is a sense in which once you realize that this could be your last day, then that kind of resets your priorities. But also, I think the thing that affected me in a certain way, because you might think, this idea that is something like your each day needs to be the best day it can be. But I think more for me, I realized that this is enough. So once you got into a mindset where you've organized your life well and you're satisfied, then the next day is sort of like a gift, right? Instead of something you expect. And the joke I tell myself is something like, I've had a good run, and if it ends, then it ends, but this has been really good. And so when you get in that mindset where what you have is satisfying, then it's not like you don't want the next day, but it's really nice when you get it and it's not expected. If that makes any sense. I'm not sure that was the best way to frame it, but it did help me, and it helped me more to think about being satisfied with what I have than any of the arguments about how non-perception or annihilation is not a harm. I think those are good arguments, and I think they distill a certain kind of fear. But to me, the idea is that desiring the future in a certain way is harmful, and that once you stop doing that, you can organize your life in a way to be satisfied.
Yeah, that brought to mind, I did a quick search here as you were talking, the one fragment that goes, "He who needs tomorrow least most gladly greets the coming day." So that's exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, exactly. I was really struck by that. And I mean, I think that's just true. So
Yeah.
It's sort of like, I think Epicurus thinks that living itself, when you're living the Epicurean life, is pleasant. And so the idea that you get to do it more is great. You don't have to do it more, but yeah, the idea that you wake up the next day and you're like, I'm still living a really good life. I think if you didn't expect that, that makes it more pleasant in the way that Epicurus thinks everything that is, I don't want to say extravagant, but it's not necessary for your well-being is a hit of pleasure.
Yeah, and I maintained on the forum, too, that Epicurus really encourages us to take pleasure in the everyday things, too, that it's not the big, giant, trips to Rome or life on the beach or something like that, he really wants us to take pleasure in those little everyday things that happen to us as well.
Yeah, I guess I like the as well there, because one of the things that and this is, I think, something that you all are concerned with, and we can talk about more. One of the things I hesitate to do, a lot of people like to take away those like sort of big trips to Rome or
Right.
these sort of things that we consider in some sense, I think, unfortunately, we consider like overindulgent or something like that, sort of like guilty pleasures almost. Mm-hmm. I think that those are really important to Epicurus. They're just things that are better insofar as they're rare and you can savor them. Mm-hmm. It's not like on your bucket list, like your life will not have been worth it if you don't make it to Rome.
Right.
But I do think that he thinks that all sorts of things can sort of enrich your life. But yeah, I think the main things are the things that are within reach. I mean, one of the things I think I've mentioned to one of you is that I kind of went down a rabbit hole with the novel Lonesome Dove.
Yes.
And one of the reasons I went down the rabbit hole, I mean, I read it actually before this happened, but I noticed in the introduction that Larry McMurtry described the character Gus, who's just a totally lovable character, as an Epicurean and his friend Call as a Stoic. And so I thought, well, to what extent is, what kind of conception of Epicurean is McMurtry working with here? Because he was hyper educated, probably one of the most well-read novelists in American literature at the time. And one of the great lines that Gus has is something like, there's this woman and she wants to go to San Francisco. And he says something like, life in San Francisco is still just life. And that you're better off taking pleasure in smaller things like comfortable beds and tasty food. And of course, because he's trying to seduce her, he says something like feisty gentlemen such as myself. But there is a sense in which what he really does want you to do is focus on the pleasures that are easy and within reach and simple. But I think he does think trips to Rome really do kind of add something or enrich an already good experience, maybe is a better way to say it.
No, I think you're spot on with that. For one thing, you've definitely made me want to go back and read Lonesome Dove again. But
it is really funny to
do
because I did actually, I found myself wanting to write about it. And then I was thought, I'll just go down a rabbit hole. So I did scribble some stuff out. But yeah, it's actually, there's a lot more Epicureanism than you would think. And my thought is that he probably got it from Montaigne, who did write a lot about Epicurus, and McMurtry did a lot of French literature and Shakespearean stuff. So I think that's where he got it, if I were guessing. But there is a lot of Hellenistic philosophy in Lonesome Dove, oddly.
That's great. And the other thing I think, too, you keep using the word enrich, too, and I think that's absolutely right, because, I mean, you bring up in the book a lot about that the whole idea is to make those memories that you can rely on in the hard times and when you get older and that sort of thing. And so I think that those little pleasures that the trips to Rome, the trips to the beach, that sort of thing, are those ones that you replay in your mind as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because I just use this word enrich, and I'm kind of extemporaneously giving my take on Epicurus. And what I thought was, why didn't I use that word in the book? That would have been a really good word to explain what these natural and unnecessary desires give you, right? Because Epicurus says you don't need them. And that has led some people to think they don't contribute anything. But I do think because you don't need them, I do think that they can enrich an experience without making it the sort of thing that if you die without them, your life has been bad.
You've done a really good job in conveying that, I think, both here and in the book.
I'm going to police myself here, but you mentioned Montaigne, so I have to mention this quote because it kind of ties in with a lot of what we're talking about. He says, "I want death to find me planting my cabbages, heedless of death, and still more unconcerned about the unfinished garden." And that says a lot to me about living for the day and not being concerned about living a long time. Kind of doubles back with something you were talking about a little bit ago.
Yeah, I mean that there's people who know Montaigne a lot better than I do, but I mean, he worked through that a lot. A lot of his writing was to deal with his own fear of death and his grief. And he quoted Lucretius, I think, more than anything else in his text. And he didn't always say, hey, I'm quoting Lucretius, because he wasn't all that good about things like that. But I do think that by the end of his life, he had figured out how to face his own mortality and how to handle grief. And he talks about grief, and he essentially says that the Epicurean approach is better, that he has gained more from distraction. And in that sense, he's a lot like Cicero. So Cicero, of course, hated the Epicureans, but when his daughter died, he went to his friend Atticus's house and said that he was handling his grief by writing about philosophy. And that's about as paradigmatic a distraction as you can get. So I think Montaigne did gain a lot from Epicurus, and he did see that as one of his lifetime projects, was to make his peace with death. And it's kind of nice that he ended up capturing it in that cabbage passage.
Yeah, one thing that many people might not know is that his edition of Lucretius does survive. So if you read French, you can read his marginalia, and a lot of it, I gather, is quite interesting. He received the poem in a way that a lot of people of his time did not.
Yeah, he had a pretty large library, I think, and I would love to look at it. I'm sure, if I did a little bit of internet sleuthing, I might be able to, but my French is not great. I have friends, though. That's one of the nice things about having resources of people who have good French.
One thing I thought was interesting that struck me as you were talking over the last few minutes about the enriching, and you used the phrase guilty pleasure, which is, I think, such an interesting term, having talked about the Puritans here, that's one of those things that sort of wheedled its way into the cultural milieu, so to speak. Even the term guilty pleasure sort of rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah, I don't like it either. But one of the things that I find interesting about the phrase guilty pleasure, one of the ways guilty pleasures comes out that I find fascinating is that people find something pleasant that other people don't find pleasant. Right. So it's sort of like I have this guilty pleasure of really liking Taylor Swift, right? But none of my friends think Taylor Swift has any artistic merit. And so I have to describe it as like a guilty pleasure. And so I do think there's even a sort of hedonism involved in guilty pleasures.
That's a good point. Oh, I like that. Yeah.
So that's why I think the kind of snobbery imposter syndrome thing comes in, because I think people should own what gives them pleasure. There's a sense where it's sort of like, oh, well, what I need to do is find the same things as other people, pleasing as other people. And then I think there is a guilt that some people have about extravagances that stems from either the sense that they realize rightly that those things are available to them and not to others. And so they're actually expressing a kind of reserve that's admirable. So sort of like you don't go on and on about your trip to Rome with a friend who's financially struggling. But I do think that there is another sense in which, when we do these things, we shouldn't feel bad that we've taken that opportunity that was there for us, right? So you shouldn't be like, I got this weird opportunity to go to Greece for a month and I'd never been, and I went with all these Duke students, which was itself an adventure. But I don't want to have to apologize for the fact that I got an opportunity to go to Greece for 4 weeks when I'd always wanted to go.
Right.
So I think that there's a sense in which there are diplomatic times to mention it or not, but you shouldn't feel bad that good things happen to you.
That's an excellent way to put it. Yeah.
Let me use the guilty pleasure discussion to generalize for just a minute on several things that you've talked about. The issue of sort of intense experiences that we often associate with the word pleasure. Some people see a tension between pleasure versus what they understand Epicurus to be teaching about in terms of tranquility or ataraxia. How do you reconcile the issue of avoidance of pain versus the pursuit of pleasure? In other words, is Epicurus saying that it is so important to avoid pain that you won't do anything ever that leads to pain? You've been discussing contentment as well, not needing to live forever, those kind of issues. How does a person who's trying to understand Epicurus integrate all that into something that they can understand Once they've been to Rome, should they just be content and never try to go again? And of course, what I'm talking about is sort of an issue of ambition. Can you try to bring all that into a package for us?
Yeah, so I'll start with just this idea of whether Epicurus is really only about tranquility, because there is a very common, I think, misunderstanding. And I mean that it's a misunderstanding even among those people who admire Epicurus. It's not sort of people who are out to mock him and then they set up an easy target. I think there is a sense in which people think that what Epicurus wants is tranquility understood as the lack of anxiety that stems from all sorts of things like ambition or desires about the future. And so they do focus on this idea that really like Epicurus thinks like you should pare down all your desires to this little class of things. And then once they're satisfied, you shouldn't want anything else. And they'll even say that this kind of odd class of desires Epicurus has, he calls them natural and unnecessary. I call them extravagant because there's just no way to write natural and necessary, natural and unnecessary, unnatural and unnecessary over and over again in a book. It would just kill everybody. So I call them extravagant. And there are a certain number of people who think that Epicurus thinks you shouldn't care about extravagances at all. And that's, I think, the ascetic mistake that people make. So they just say he wants the necessary things and then you shouldn't even care about the others. But when I started writing the book, my original working title was Doing Pleasure Right. And so I really wanted pleasure to be in the title of the book. And I love my editor. She's amazing to work with. But when she took the book forward to the Oxford people to decide whether to offer it a contract, she changed the title to something like Feeling Good. And I thought, no, I don't want that. And so she didn't like Doing Pleasure Right for reasons I kind of understand. And so I ended up with Living for Pleasure because I really didn't want pleasure to not be in there. Because I think that one of the mistakes people make is they make Epicurus too much like the other tranquility aiming philosophies. And that takes away what's distinctive about it. So I do think that focusing on tranquility is a mistake because I think there's other stuff in Epicurus. That said, I do think that Epicurus thinks probably the first step that most people need to take is to get rid of anxiety, because I think he thinks we have this vision of what a pleasant life would look like. And often the pleasant life is not a jet setting kind of thing. It's actually, you have this image of like a family sitting down to a table or a certain kind of learning experience or something like that. And then he thinks that there's all this background noise that gets in the way of that. And so we do want to have these rich experiences, but in order to have them, we have to strip out a lot of the things that make those experiences either impossible or kind of mar them. And so I do think he thinks a lot of what we have to do is clear away the anxiety so that then we can prioritize pleasures and choose well among them and savor them. And so I think what people don't realize is getting rid of this background anxiety is just kind of in the service of loving your life and loving the pleasures that you get. And so it's like they stop at that first step. And I think that he thinks all of this anxiety is what's making us prioritize the wrong things and have the wrong feelings. And if we could tackle that, then we would clear up both headspace and time to pursue things that give us the life that technically we want, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. And I think you really did a good job in the book about balancing that tranquility or that freedom from anxiety, both for itself and in the service of being able to enjoy other things. So I think that really came across in the book as a constant theme that I think you really help people see the practical benefits of that.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, right? So people are so charitable. It's a charitable impulse that makes them say, look, Epicurus is not about, continuous partying. He even makes that clear.
He makes
right?
that point, yeah.
Not about fish and extravagances, right? And so they lean into that so far in the conception of the impulse of charity that they overcorrect. And they make him sort of like opposed to pleasure.
Yeah.
So I think that in some sense, I understand why people do that, because that's the criticism that's leveled against him and you want to clear that up. But I think, they don't find that middle ground that I think is clearly evidently there.
I've come around to the idea that he advocates both pleasure that you get internally from tranquility and memories and that sort of thing, but he also endorses those pleasures that come from the outside, from being with friends or going to Rome, since that seems to be the metaphor we've hit upon. But I think that it's just the fact that you're able to have a little bit more control over how you react to things internally if you approach them with that tranquility and freedom from
But I actually didn't get a passport until I was 37, which is kind of surprising for an academic. I'm not super cultured. But there are other things about going to Rome that are important for Epicurus. So you shouldn't go to Rome if your mother is sick, right?
Right.
And so there are ways in which you have to think about what matters. And so sometimes those pleasures are okay and sometimes they're not.
Right. Exactly.
Now, there, when you say sometimes those pleasures are okay and sometimes they're not, that leads me to one of the other topics I want to make sure we cover today, and that's the distinction between the Stoics and the Epicureans as to virtue. I'm sure you get that question a lot among your students, and it's also a matter of frustration as we look at modern discussions of Stoicism today. The ancient Stoics seem to be very, very clear about how virtue was their goal. The modern Stoics seem to be a little bit less clear about that because they seem to want to blend over and just talk about living well with the implication that they're living happily and that we're all just interested in living happily. But when you really dig into the philosophy and try to distinguish Stoicism versus Epicureanism, it seems like that there is an eternal dispute between the two of them as to the role of virtue versus the role of pleasure. We were talking earlier about shouting a little bit. There's an example in the inscription of Diogenes of Oinoander in which he even uses the word that he's shouting about this issue, that virtue is not the goal, but as a tool towards living happily, which means a life of pleasure. What's the best way to really get at that issue? Do you think?
I think in some sense, I will say I prefer to think about the ancient Stoics rather than the modern Stoics, in part because I think it's a lot easier to see the differences in the ancient world. I think those get sort of overlooked in the contemporary landscape of modern Stoicism. But in general, kind of what they were debating about, not so much in the weeds, but it's technical. They wanted to know the thing that was intrinsically good, so good in and of itself. And the Stoics thought that what was good in and of itself, so it was good independent of its consequences, was virtue. So even if virtue led to all sorts of bad things, it's totally good, right? That's not the best way to put it. But anyway, it's good in and of itself. And the only thing that's bad in and of itself is vice. And the Epicureans thought, no, it's pleasure. And there are different accounts of how they got to that assumption. But yeah, the big difference is that for Epicurus, virtue is good only insofar as it produces pleasure. So it's an instrumental good. It's good because of what it produces, not in itself, whereas pleasure is good in itself. And there are a lot of reasons that people didn't like Epicurus's claim that virtue was instrumentally good. And part of it is because they thought, well, what if it's not? Right? So what if vice is instrumentally advantageous for pleasure? And they didn't like the idea that this was sort of contingent or circumstantial rather than a necessary connection. And so they thought, well, look, he could very well be licensing vice here, at least in certain circumstances. And I think that's more of a legitimate criticism than the idea that like pleasure is just bad. So I think that there's something to be said for the criticism about where Epicurus puts virtue, but I think Epicurus himself thinks virtue is always instrumental to a good life. And so for him, it's a little bit of just, I don't want to say semantic or conceptual matter, but he just thinks that to live a good life, you do have to be virtuous. So what's the big deal? But the Stoics just really didn't like that. And the other reason that they just don't like pleasure is that it's what animals care about. And they tend to think that human beings are just, that they have these rational capacities that are images or kinds of in line with divine capacities, and that using those capacities has to be what makes human life good. It can't be this very animalistic thing. So they didn't just object to the idea that it made virtue contingent on pleasure, but that it was just too lowly a good for human beings.
And it seems that probably derives from the Epicurean worldview or the physics or their ideas of the nature of the universe. And I know that in your book, you don't necessarily go really far into those details of Epicurean philosophy, but I do think I recall you saying that the Epicureans certainly saw their ethics and basically all of their worldview as deriving from their understanding of the way the world works.
Yeah, I think so. And also just a kind of natural science of not only the world, but of human beings or human animals. So I think that they were sort of scientists of happiness. And so the term that gets used a lot in philosophical language is naturalism. So this idea that there is a nature to human beings. And it doesn't have to be sort of an abstract nature, sort of like an independent of human beings, but there are things that make our life go well. And that's what our nature is. And Epicurus wanted to figure that out. And then he decided that what was natural was this state that we can have where we're largely free of anxiety, and that itself is pleasant, and it makes all sorts of other things pleasant for us. So he was really kind of studying us as a distinctive kind of animal, not where we have some divine capacity within us like the Stoics thought, but just where we have sort of powers of deliberation about the future because we're beings in time. We have a sense of ourselves as having a past, a present, and a future. And also we are really good at instrumental reasoning. And so, yeah, I think that he's a naturalist in a way, a naturalist that treats us like animals in a way that the Stoics are not. I think that that's actually one of those things that is interesting because I wrote this article about whether modern Stoics are actually Epicureans. And the thing is that a lot of these modern Stoics, I think there are a number of ways that modern Stoicism not as kind of misrepresents ancient Stoicism or smudges it or along the margins or along the edges for their own purposes, in much the same way that the Romans did that too. The Romans kind of perverted Greek Stoicism. But the thing is that like a lot of these modern Stoics, they believe in evolutionary theory, and evolutionary theory tells us that we're animals and that the way that we navigate the world, at least initially, is almost primarily through pleasure and pain. And so technically they're already on board with that assumption that made the Stoics so angry. So the evolutionary bit and the fact that we're animals, I think that's the way many of us think of ourselves now. And so that was a huge point of contention for the Stoics. And I think that modern Stoics are actually on the Epicurean side on that front. Modern Stoics are also tend to be physicalist in general, right? So they think the natural world is governed by laws, that it was not created by a being for the good of human beings, and that gods, should they exist, don't intervene in the world. And so in a lot of ways, the things that made Epicureanism distinctive about, the natural world and human beings as things you study like other natural animals or beings, the modern Stoics actually already believe. And so if you think that these systems hang together and that's the core of Epicureanism and the dispute, then you just have to ask yourself, well, why do these modern Stoics think they're modern Stoics if these core commitments of Stoicism are things they reject and there are core commitments in Epicureanism that they accept? And so part of me just wonders, like, what is it that they have against pleasure?
Yeah, there's an interesting way that some of this was expressed in the ancient world, and it's kind of harsh in some ways, but the question was asked, it's almost like a knock-knock joke, the way it reads. The question was asked, why is it that so many people from other schools are seen to leave those schools of philosophy and become Epicureans, but with very few exceptions, no Epicureans are seen to leave Epicureanism and join other schools? And the response to that was, because you can make a eunuch out of a man, but you can't make a man out of a eunuch. So it very much was a bright line here between the way that Epicurus and the Epicureans looked at this issue, the sort of lack of any differentiation between lower orders of animals and higher orders of animals, of which humans are one example, in the way that, there is no divine spark, there is no oversoul, there is no Godhead that distinguishes in any meaningful way between humans and other animals. And certainly some of the philosophies in the ancient world really pushed back against that issue and policed the boundaries of that issue in a very hardline way.
Yeah, I do want to give a shout out to one of my favorite books about Epicurus, which is The Invention and Gendering of Epicurus by Pamela Gordon. And she has a lot of really just super funny anecdotes in there, but it also does a really good job of showing why Epicurus was often associated in a derogatory sense with sort of a non-masculinity. And I think that a lot of that just stems from their disinterest in things like politics, the places where male citizens were known to distinguish themselves, right? So if you were an Athenian male, then you would look to be, say, a general or a politician. And insofar as they say those were not worthwhile activities, people took that to be an insult against these major ways of life that the Stoics, or at least the Roman Stoics, were very fond of. And so there's a sense in which the idea that they're like not masculine has to do with the idea that they would rather stay at home like a woman or something along those lines. But yeah, so I do think that there's a lot of ways in which Epicureans get insulted. Even just the idea that pleasure is feminine in case matters to them. So there are people who left Epicureanism and maligned it, but generally Epicureanism was distinctive and that it didn't change very much. Stoicism, there was a lot of disagreement among Stoics, but Epicureans kind of towed the party line for centuries.
Yeah, about 7 centuries, in fact. Just to kind of add some symmetry to what you said about how pleasure is a feminine word in some of these ancient languages, virtue actually is directly related to the word vir or vir in Latin, which means man. So there's a distinct masculine connotation there. So it is an interesting thing to talk about. It's something we do talk about on this podcast fairly frequently, not something we tend to shy away from.
The same thing is true of courage, right? Andrea, which is essentially manliness. So there is a sense in which when you make them instrumental, people don't like that.
Yeah, this brings to mind one of the things that both intrigued me and attracted me to exploring Epicureanism from the very beginning was the fact that Epicurus did seem to welcome everybody into the garden, whether they were clutch your pearls women or slaves or any members of society seemed to be welcome into the garden, where it seemed to be a much more exclusive attendance at the other schools of philosophy in the ancient world.
That's actually one of those places where, again, this book was good for me because it led me to cross the barriers into classicism more than I have to when I do a lot of my writing for scholarly journals. And so I did learn a lot more about Epicureanism as a cultural phenomenon that I would have otherwise. But it's true that this is all still, in that respect, my understanding is somewhat limited, and I definitely rely on other scholars who have done a lot more of the legwork. But I really do recommend that Pamela Gordon book. It's excellent.
Dr. Austin, this is a perfect place to bring in a point that Don had earlier suggested we wanted to cover in this podcast today. The difficulties of trying to translate an ancient philosophy into modern terms. And for example, Don himself has spent a lot of time attempting to learn Greek as part of his study of Epicurus. Most of the rest of us are not as successful. And to what extent can you translate an ancient philosophy into modern terms successfully?
Yeah, and I would use the word translation in its broadest sense because it's also, I'm curious about your take on translating, in quotes, an ancient philosophy into the modern world, with all of our scientific advancements and that sort of thing, but also just the whole idea of trying to use some of those terms, like I think we even mentioned ataraxia and things like that, translating those terms into modern ideas as well. I'd be interested to get your take on either of those tacks.
Yeah, so I was thinking of translate in both of the senses you were mentioning, right? So how effectively can we live this life, this ancient life now, as a sort of translation, and then the textual issues. So as far as the extent to which we can do this now, I think Epicureanism is a lot better suited for modern life than most of the other ancient Greek approaches to living. Skepticism gets a bad rap for a lot of reasons, but I think there are ways in which, or domains or areas of life where skepticism works fairly well. But I do think Epicureanism, because it is at the margins, of course, and we've worked out a lot more details of the science, and some of Epicurean science was wrong, it does have the naturalistic physicalist approach to the world that people have now. And so I think in that respect, that even in itself gives it some better grounding for being a life worth choosing. I do think that ancient Epicureans recognize certain ways of living as Epicurean. One thing I don't think happens very often now is the idea of community, a community of Epicureans. I think we tend to be kind of atomistic. So we live as an Epicurean almost individually. You all accepted because you have an Epicurean community online. But I do think that that's an element of Epicureanism that is harder to incorporate into American life. Stoicism is so individualistic that it makes it easier because it's sort of all about like being resilient and independent and self-sufficient. And Epicureanism just doesn't have that. They don't think we are self-sufficient. We need other people, and we need other people who can help give us the reassurance we need. And the reassurance we need comes primarily from other Epicurean-minded people. So the community aspect, I think, is harder in American culture. But I do think that like a prudent approach to pleasure is easier than a very austere conception like Stoicism. I mean, the truth is, Stoicism really does say your child is not good. And if you have one,
exactly,
that doesn't matter. And if your child dies, it doesn't affect your happiness. And so there are all sorts of very intuitive commitments that Epicurus has that Stoicism doesn't, because they foreground pleasure and pain rather than virtue and vice. The Stoics just say, like, look, if it doesn't make you vicious, then it doesn't matter. Yep. The other thing about the Greek Stoics that's always worth remembering is they didn't think any of us were virtuous. Oddly, they even thought that every moral error you make is equal. I don't know if you're familiar with this image, but they thought that the person who is 1 inch below the surface of the water is just as much drowning as the person 1,000 feet below the surface of the water. And so it didn't really matter if you got close to virtue, you were still drowning. And so the Stoics, especially the early Stoics, they weren't making a life that was for normal people or for the average person. And I think Epicurus was, and that's another way in which he's very applicable to modern life. And there's probably other things that would occur to me if I kept going with
that's great.
on that.
So it sounds like if we took Pythocles or Diogenes Laertius, that they would at least recognize what we're trying to do in the modern world as Epicureanism. It sounds like there might be some more question with the Stoics.
Yeah, I think that's true. I don't think the Stoics would recognize modern Stoicism as Stoicism. And there are things that ancient Epicureans would probably find really bizarre about the way that we live. But I think they would see people who are trying to live a pleasant, largely anxiety-free life as sort of at least amenable to Epicureanism, especially if they have the right kind of commitments about the natural world. As for the language, Epicurus's Greek was so technical and so difficult. To some extent, the letters are not as hard to read as some of the other stuff like the key doctrines, but Epicurus kind of made up a lot of stuff, but so did other ancient Greek philosophers. And so you do kind of get used to their technical vocabulary. But one example actually that probably is good is just to think about, at the very beginning of Lucretius says, look, this is going to be really hard because I'm going to have to make up a lot of Latin to explain Epicurus because our language just doesn't have that technical vocabulary. And so I'm going to do it myself. And Cicero says the same thing. He's like, well, look, there are all these technical terms and I've got to come up with Latin equivalents rather than just keep using the Greek. And so that's just a perpetual problem. And it's kind of unclear how much things get lost. But Cicero really prides himself, I think, at the beginning of De Finibus. No one has written more philosophy than I did, and I made up all these words. So
Cicero was never shy about touting himself.
No, he was a little proud. But yeah, so I think that there's always going to be that problem. And even, now, if you have contemporary philosophers, just ask them, what is a reason for action? And they're going to talk past one another. They've all got different ideas of what a reason does, whether a reason motivates or whether a reason justifies, and whether a reason has to, fit the justification, or whether just any old reason will do and count as a reason. And then if they don't clarify all that at the beginning, they'll just talk to one another for hours and argue. And you're just like, I don't know that anything is happening here. And so I think that getting your terms clear in philosophical discussion, even if you share the same language, is hard. So I don't want to make it sound like, now it's impossible. No one can do philosophy anymore. But I do think that there is some consistent philosophical terminology. It has been sort of agreed upon. But the further you get into the weeds, the more overwhelming it gets. And one of the reasons I wrote this book is that I think the core of Epicureanism doesn't require that. I think it rewards it. I think that there's a lot to be said for some disputes that are practically relevant. But when it comes to writing a book, even to convince people who are either otherwise hostile to Epicureanism or just people who are actually interested in living a pleasant life, I think that thankfully you don't have to get into strange, why does this take the genitive when usually it doesn't? So yeah, but I do think that it can be translated it can be translated at a level that it makes it accessible to other people.
That's great.
And so to follow up on that for just a second, and so the different translation controversies that we run into, a classic example being, I see people continue to debate, did Epicurus recommend that you should get married or actually recommend not to get married? Maybe like Lucretius says, ultimately, once you've learned some of the basics, you can sniff out yourself the direction that he probably would have gone.
Yeah, I mean, that whole marriage thing, for me, I just find it deeply puzzling. I mean, Gassendi was like, this can't be right. And it's one of those times when I think, well, no, it's definitely right. I mean, if you read the will, it's clear his followers named children after him. He took over the guardianship for Metrodorus's kids. And he even said, like, make sure to give Metrodorus's daughter a dowry, at least as long as she marries another Epicurean. So it doesn't sound like a man who thinks like, oh, no, no one should marry. So what exactly led people to alter the text there, I think, is this sort of impulse that people have to asceticize Epicurus. This idea that somehow he would not have attachments, he would be entirely self-sufficient, when I think that's just part of making Epicurus more in line with other Hellenistic philosophies. It kind of aligns the distinctiveness. And so there, at least, I think we have countervailing evidence, namely in the will. But there are other places, right, where people just copied stuff into the margins and then it got copied into the text. So yeah, the texts are corrupt. But, one thing worth remembering about Epicurus is that what we have is an abundant wealth of texts by comparison to, say, the ancient Greek Stoics, where we have like one hymn. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, in some sense, we can get really frustrated that we don't have more of on nature and those sorts of things. But man, we have so much Epicurean text.
It's kind of remarkable, isn't it, that the way in which we have these weird sources for getting some of these texts, and it's particular to the Epicurean school. We have Lucretius, the longest didactic philosophical poem that survives from the ancient world. We have the inscription in Wanda, the longest inscription of any kind from the ancient world. We have the largest cache of papyrus scrolls that survives from the ancient world, all of which are dealing with Epicurean philosophy. So I agree with you. There is a wonderful wealth of information that has survived in very weird ways.
Yeah, I mean, I always think about how despondent Aristotle would be to discover that his dialogues are lost. Because I think people thought his dialogues were even better than Plato's, but they're all gone. So what we have are essentially his lecture notes, which is why they're so awful to read. So yeah, what survives and what gets lost. And it's almost always so subject to fortune. You just think, wow, that crisis was narrowly averted.
Yeah, and the fact that we have anything that survives of Epicurus and the Epicurean school is amazing, because it was so anathema to the Christian texts and things like that were being copied. And they just sort of, the fact that we still have people copying over Diogenes Laertius, and the entire book 10 has to do with Epicurus. It is surprising, but I do agree with Josh. It's great that we have like the longest this and the biggest that. It's like, oh, hey, look at that.
When things come from the past, how much do we have to worry that something was mistranslated? Or even in modern translations, how do we determine which is a good translation? And also, do you have any knowledge about the Vatican Sayings? Are those trustworthy? The way that has come to us, is that something that we can be assured that Epicurus really did write those?
So I'll start from the last one. With the Vatican Sayings, I made an executive decision to take them to be Epicurus, because I haven't found, Vatican 23, I think, the one about friendship, that gets a lot of attention because it makes it sound like friendship is good in and of itself. And so some people have been tempted to say, oh, well, that's later Epicureanism. So there are some where I think, well, is that really consistent with Epicureanism? But if they're not by Epicurus, I take them to be by Epicureans. And maybe they're not perfectly reflecting Epicurus. Maybe they're even reflecting changes in the school. But for the most part, I think they tried to stay pretty consistent. They didn't want to depart far from Epicurus, except for on some things. Like they thought maybe we needed an argument for why pleasure was the good. And they were a little hesitant about his views that friendship is not good in and of itself. But I just decided there's not a good enough reason to not take them as expressing at least Epicurean ideas. As for the other questions about how confident we can be, there are times when people do what Gassendi did and just say like, oh, well, Epicurus can't approve of marriage, so I'll just change it. And thankfully, most of the time what we have is a manuscript tradition. So we'll have different manuscripts and you can compare them. Usually there's a thing at the bottom called an apparatus criticus, and it'll say like, hey, this manuscript doesn't have this in the genitive. It actually has it in the dative. And so then, classicists and philosophers will fight over which manuscript to go with. But at least generally you can compare them. It's when you only have one manuscript that you're really out of luck. And sometimes that's just true. But at least you can see, oh, Gassendi amended this, right? Because he told us he did. So then you can fight over which one is the best. But for the most part, I think we can be relatively confident that we at least have like a version of the original Diogenes. Now, what he was working with, where he got it, I think we just have to say, well, that's the starting point. But I do think he was an Epicurean, and I think he wasn't trying to make Epicurus into something he was not. So I think he was an Epicurean. Some people disagree. And I think he was really trying to give the world the texts. And so I think he probably did them right. Now, there's no way to not make a transcription error. I mean, all of us have tried to copy something and we left out a word or we misspelled something. I looked at my book last night and I was like, oh my God, there are errors. So again, I think even there, the worry is when the error changes the meaning. And that's, I guess, in some sense, you always have to just think, well, that's going to happen. And hopefully we can stick to the big picture. I try not to get into the manuscript tradition, but sometimes when you're writing a scholarly paper, you just can't avoid it. Sorry, that was a really long-winded answer.
Thank you.
Emily, we have a lot of people who get interested in Epicurean philosophy because of the science that's involved in Lucretius. One of the most popular books in recent years about Epicurus, entitled The Swerve. And so we have a lot of people who get interested in Epicurean philosophy because of a history of science interest. And I know you don't cover much of that background in your book. What is your personal take on the science aspect of Epicurean philosophy?
I guess because I'm not a historian of the philosophy of science, I don't have really nuanced views on that. Like I couldn't get into the trenches with people who spend a lot of time on it. I do think that it's a very natural way to get into Epicurus because it is so modern. It's shockingly modern for an ancient theory. And people who want to dismiss ancient philosophy because, I don't know, Thales thought everything came out of water, have a lot of trouble dismissing Epicurus because, his science is pretty fascinating. And then people who are interested in Renaissance science and Enlightenment science, I think The Swerve gives a good picture of how influential Epicurus's scientific ideas were. And what's interesting is that a lot of those people in the Enlightenment were drawn to the science, but repulsed by the morality. And so they tried to make Epicurus kind of like this really good guy who happened to have some not so great views. So one thing that I always wonder when people come into Epicurus through the science is to what extent they then find the ethics and the views about human interactions and pleasure equally compelling. And I haven't talked to enough people who came into Epicurus that way to find out whether they think, oh, the science is great, but this ethics is horrible.
Which is interesting because the Epicureans thought they were inextricably linked.
Oh, yeah, definitely. That's the thing that I don't like about modern Stoicism is all of these schools thought of themselves as coherent philosophies so that you couldn't separate the parts really. You kind of needed all of them. And so the idea that you could just carve off part of it, they would think that's like mutilating the philosophy.
And that is one of the things that amazes me about the science of Epicurus. While maybe factually wrong now in the way that he expresses it, the fact that it can be translated into modern terms into that naturalistic philosophy just amazes me. We're talking about a 2,300-year-old tradition here that can still be talked about in a coherent way without mutilating the philosophy.
Yeah, and I mean, just to think that he did it all on the basis of rational, it must be that way. I can't see it, but it must be that way.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
That so much of it did turn out to be right once we could start seeing things. And I think a lot of, I've mentioned this elsewhere, but a lot of astrophysicists, everybody wants to throw in a quote at the beginning of their science for some reason, and they generally choose Lucretius. They're sort of like, here is an ancient predecessor to my view, and almost always they choose Lucretius. And so there is some kind of line of connection that people find. People like to tie things to ancient traditions, and Epicurus is the best way to go there.
Yeah, and it's almost in some ways analogous to Einstein's thought experiments, where that's how he would just sort of like, think about a problem and try and come up with a theory of relativity and stuff. It's almost like Epicurus sort of, thinking of, well, how can this be? And let's think about different alternatives and that sort of thing. So that's kind of an interesting modern analogy too.
Don, it's interesting that you mentioned Einstein there because going along with what Emily was just saying about trying to draw connections to the ancient world, there was a German edition of Lucretius in which Einstein was actually commissioned to write the foreword. So that's out there if anyone wants to go look for it. It's interesting to read.
That's really fascinating.
One thing I'd sort of like to mention before we get to death and destruction is is we have people who come to the forum, and what they're particularly looking for when they come to the forum is, okay, I'm interested in the philosophy. I think I understand it okay. What I'm looking for is a meditation style approach to like how I can apply this to my life. I'm referring to the book by Marcus Aurelius there. And while you don't go to that level, Emily, the last chapter of your book, I think, is going to be useful to people like that, because it's all about specifically this question of how do we apply this philosophy? What are some practices? The chapter is called Practicing Epicureanism. And in this chapter, I think you represent it as being a challenge that you laid for yourself. You know, if I'm going to write a book about this, I need to actually see if it works. So maybe you want to talk about that approach a little bit, because I really think there are people who are going to find this whole book very useful, but particularly that last chapter. There's a group of people who that is tailored for. I think they're out there.
Yeah, and actually that's one of the things that my editor really wanted and wants the series to be. In some sense, it dovetails with this movement in especially ancient philosophical pedagogy to bring back these philosophies as ways of living, not just as exercises in textual interpretation, because they were meant to be lived. But it is hard to figure out with Epicurus what the practice involves. He clearly thinks you do practice it because he says you should practice it with your friends, but he doesn't say, oh, here are some habits. So I did have to suss some of those out from the text. And then a lot of it, actually, some of it came from Philodemus, and some of the practices we just get from the Romans, and they overlap with Stoic practices in part because the Romans had a hodgepodge approach to these schools. But I do think that some of the things that worked for me, one of them is a little bit cumbersome, but I really do think people benefit a lot from writing about things. So if they struggle with something like generosity or prioritizing their friends, writing about why you should do that, or, you know, why something else is bad is super helpful. It takes time, but it clarifies a lot of things. And I think that actually for me, the thing that helps the most is to think about priorities, because I think there are a lot of moments we have where we have to make a decision about how we're going to spend our time. And for me, the thing that has been most important is prioritize your friends and prioritize memories. Because, I don't know, you get home at the end of the day and you're tired and your friend says, do you want to come over and order pizza? And you're like, no, not really, because I'm tired. But it's interesting that I'm just like, no, I'm going to do that. And then I'm going to be happy that I did it, because I know that that will actually be a good thing. It's just I have to get over the exhaustion. Or, I mean, there's definitely going to be a point, and hopefully, I mean, I'm sure that my university won't listen to it, but oddly, I'm actually unexpectedly good at administrative tasks. And so I think the administration has been, thinking, oh, well, maybe she should join the dean's office or something. But you lose 2 months of your free time, and it's relatively thankless work. But, you get more money and a bit of attention. And so, it's sometimes hard to turn down things. And so I keep thinking Epicurus does not want me to enter the administration. So a little bit of it is just, for me, is about carving out time. But also, I think the gratitude bit, I have started journaling, which I thought I wouldn't really do. But I have a good friend his father got Alzheimer's very early, kind of early onset. And his mother, in the process of being a caregiver, some people said, you should consider journaling. And so she started, and that was something like 20 years ago, and she does it every day. And then her daughter gave her this gratitude journal. You were supposed to do it for like 30 days or something. And the daughter, my friend's sister, did it for 30 days and said, hey, I did it. And his mother is on like day 533 or something. And so I do think that I have a very rich episodic memory, but having reminders is really good, especially when you start thinking about times when, you might really want to remember the good things about people. So I do think that there are practical things you do. I don't know that I have any rituals or anything like that.
When I read books like Meditations or Epictetus, it's a lot of like, when you get out of bed in the morning, do X, Y, and Z, very, very unusually specific approaches. But you take a more general approach, which I think is more universalizable, if that's a word. It's something that more people, I think, if they really try to do it, are going to get more out of.
Yeah, and I do think it's just sort of even an idea that there are different moments in our lives where we start getting a sense of dissatisfaction. And I think we're all aware of those moments. And so being able to step back and be like, what am I actually lacking? And being able to be like, nothing actually is good. So sometimes just that idea of what do I really need to live a good life? And do I have those things? And, I consider myself very fortunate that I do. Some of that has been, I can pride myself on making intentional choices that have paid off well. But some of it really is just, I feel like, good fortune. But yeah, I have what I need. And if I can remember that, then it's a lot easier to get rid of moments of dissatisfaction.
Yeah, I think it's a really good way of putting it. We've mentioned about the vast amount of text, relatively speaking, that we have from Epicurus, but we of course lost so much, so we don't really know whether he ever did have like a list of practices, that kind of thing. But I think that you bring up a good point in that it seems to me that a lot of Epicurean philosophy is very contextual. So instead of having, here are the 10 things you need to do, and here are the 5 things you need to do here. And it seems to me that it's a lot more looking at the broad picture and making good choices and using prudence and that sort of thing that is sort of at the core of Epicurus's philosophy.
Yeah, that seems right to me.
What you were just saying, Practicing Epicureanism is the title of your last chapter of your book. We've called this podcast from the beginning Lucretius Today, even though it's really dedicated to Epicurean philosophy and to Epicurus himself. What did Lucretius do? What did Epicurus spend most of his time doing in terms of practicing Epicureanism? They were writing about it. Probably the best way of practicing Epicureanism is to, as you said, write about it, talk about it to people, because if indeed one of the most prudent things that a person can do to pursue pleasure is to have friends, then you've got to have the ability to communicate your ideas. And you've done just an excellent job in living for pleasure, in carrying out the model that Lucretius did himself in terms of explaining Epicurean philosophy in an attractive and persuasive way. Well, this is the question that I've been wanting to end on in this interview today. One of the points of your book that I found most interesting and even unique, I think you mentioned it in one of your footnotes that you'd not seen this point brought out in past discussions. Lucretius has gotten a lot of criticism, or people wonder, why in the world would you end your poem talking about the plague of Athens? And in your book, you suggest a potential answer to that question. Can you talk about that for just a moment and perhaps translate for us what might have been in Lucretius's mind in using this as the ending of his poem?
Yeah, so I guess like professionals of all sorts, we like to be relevant. And even though I actually had a chapter on pandemics planned, it was already in my book proposal. That was before the pandemic. And so when COVID hit, we were all at home and all the academics were like, well, what can I say that's relevant to this moment? I guess probably the Camus scholars were like, oh, I'll write about the plague. And the ancient Greek people were all like, well, what about the plague in Lucretius or in Thucydides? And so I had a friend who was working on Thucydides, and I had read the passage a good bit and thought about it. But, I went back to it to help him with what he was writing. And then I was kind of myself a little bit dispirited by the plague passage. Like I felt like it had a sense of being kind of like the passage where Lucretius is looking down on people, sort of like, look at all these idiots who are dying grotesque deaths. And if you're an Epicurean, you won't feel that. And so I was hesitant to write about the plague because I thought maybe it was an expression of Lucretius's condescension. But then I guess when I was working through it, I noticed that Lucretius breaks off in a very dark moment where I think it's sort of like, people were stealing each other's burial pyres. So it's like throwing my dead relative on your dead relative's pyre. But then I noticed that after that point in Thucydides, he talks about the way that the plague changed people's priorities or altered them, so that once they realized that praying wasn't, the gods weren't going to save them, it changed their idea about the role of the gods in human life. And once they realized that honor was in the future and not actually important, then they stopped caring about it. And so there are all these ways in which coming to terms with death and the plague's arbitrariness gave them a new lease on life, so to speak. And I thought, well, that's just so Epicurean that it would be shocking if that weren't where Lucretius was going with that. And so while I don't know that we can say like, oh, he intended to end the whole work with the plague, I do think he intended to finish off the plague by incorporating that, because I think it's just such a model of Epicurean approach to living once you realize that you don't have tomorrow necessarily. And it's kind of unclear even what Thucydides thinks about that. Thucydides is really hard to interpret. He even ends that passage with the way that people interpreted a prophecy on the basis of what they wanted the prophecy to say. And it's not clear whether Thucydides is mocking people who interpret prophecies. So it's unclear how traditionalist Thucydides himself is, but it's clear to me, at least, that Lucretius had that in mind and it didn't get there, and that's why it breaks off abruptly. And while I think this is somewhat novel, I will confess that when I was doing the work, I did not cull the European commentaries on Lucretius, and I tend to find that like it's usually been done, but in another language. So there may be someone else out there who's written this, but in German, and I just didn't have time to hunt it down. But it's true that I didn't find it in the commentaries that I was consulting. So, and I do think it's cool because it does fall in with that theme of once you realize that you could die, it gives you a greater appreciation of each day.
Or once you realize that you will die. I mean,
yeah, right. Well, I mean, that you could die at any moment.
Yes.
You will die, but that it could be much sooner than you had anticipated.
Yeah, Lucretius seems to talk throughout his poem that Epicurean philosophy has a bitter side to it to some degree, that people who think that they're going to be able to live an eternity in heaven in blissfulness will find it potentially bitter to hear Epicurus say that those things are not true, but that there is a offsetting reason to study the material when you realize that you only have one life to live and you best make the best of it.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I don't want to get sort of like this idea, that you find in something like Dostoevsky or Nietzsche, where there are these powers behind the scenes, some puppeteers who are trying to convince you of those things so that you play nice, mm-hmm. so that you do what you're supposed to do and express ambition and bow to the prevailing norms so that you can get a reward eventually. And that once that goes away, you kind of do become the author of your own daily existence. And that can be very unsettling for a lot of people. But it does, I think, Lucretius thinks in the end, you're going to gain from that.
I just want to say how thoroughly I've enjoyed this conversation. I've enjoyed your book, Emily. You mentioned you were open to doing this again, and I have to say, from my point of view, that would be more than welcome. I think we would love to have you back sometime.
Absolutely. Yeah, that would be great. It's just really nice to be in actually such a big number of people who are not only sort of interested in Epicurus, but really interested in Epicurus. There aren't that many people who know much about him.
We appreciate your help in trying to fix that problem, and your book is going to be one of the major tools in doing that in the coming years.
Well, thanks. You guys have been way more than kind.
Okay, as we close, is there a way our listeners can follow your work or get in touch with you?
Yeah, actually, if you can just go to the Wake Forest University philosophy page, and my email address is there, and I'm happy to correspond by email. I don't have a website or a social media account, but you can definitely contact me there at my email, and I will almost certainly write back. As far as my work, most of it is scholarly in nature, admittedly, but much of it is available at academia.edu, which is a little bit of a repository of academic papers. And most of my papers you'll discover are about Plato, but there is my Epicurus paper is there. But a lot of that is, again, scholarly work. But anybody can feel free to contact me. Now, this was a blast, really. It's nice to talk about Epicurus at a sort of high level. I have really enjoyed reading your stuff. I would say that you're way better versed in the whole of Epicureanism than pretty much anyone I know, because you really cover all of it. So yeah, it's been great to follow what you're talking about.
Okay, well, thanks very much. And we'll definitely do something again.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thank you to Dr. Austin and to our podcast panel. That completes our interview today. But if you found this discussion motivates you to want to learn more about Epicurus, please look us up at EpicureanFriends.com and consider joining us in our study and pursuit of the philosophy of Epicurus.